In Hollywood, where egos are bigger than box office numbers and celebrities rarely cancel anything for anyone, Clint Eastwood did something that left the entire entertainment industry stunned. At 92 years old, this legendary actor and director, this man who survived the Wild West on screen and the even wilder world of Hollywood off-screen, made a decision that shocked everyone. He canceled an entire international press tour. Millions of dollars were on the line. Studio executives were furious. But Clint Eastwood didn't care, because there was a young man lying in a hospital bed 3,000 miles away who didn't have much time left. And that young man had one final wish, a wish that would reveal something about Clint Eastwood that most people never knew, something that will change the way you see this Hollywood icon forever. Now, before I tell you what happened in that hospital room, you need to understand who Clint Eastwood really is, because the man you see on screen, that tough, silent cowboy who doesn't waste words, that hardened detective who stares down criminals without blinking, that's not an act. That's who he is. Born in 1930 during the Great Depression, Clint grew up in a working-class family that moved from town to town looking for work. His father was a steelworker. His mother took whatever job she could find. Young Clint learned early that life doesn't owe you anything. You work hard, you keep your mouth shut, and you take care of your own. Those values never left him, even when he became one of the biggest stars in the world. But there's something else about Clint Eastwood that the cameras don't show, something that his co-stars whisper about, but that rarely makes headlines. Behind that granite face and those steely eyes is a man with a heart that breaks for ordinary people, a man who never forgot where he came from, a man who, despite decades of fame and fortune, still answers his own phone, still reads his own mail, and still remembers that before he was a legend, he was just a kid from California who got lucky. Now let me tell you about Daniel Morrison, 52 years old, a construction foreman from Pennsylvania, a man who worked with his hands his entire life, a man who never asked for anything from anyone. Daniel had been a Clint Eastwood fan since he was 7 years old. His father took him to see the good, the bad, and the ugly at a drive-in theater in 1971. Young Daniel sat in the back of his father's pickup truck, wrapped in a blanket, watching this mysterious stranger on screen who didn't need to say much because his actions said everything. From that moment on, Daniel was hooked. Every Clint Eastwood movie that came out, Daniel was there. Dirty Harry, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Unforgiven, Gran Torino. He saw them all, most of them multiple times. For Daniel, Clint Eastwood represented something important, something that's hard to find these days. Integrity, strength without arrogance, the ability to do what's right even when it's hard. Daniel tried to live his life by those principles. He worked honest jobs. He raised 3 children with his wife of 30 years. He coached Little League Baseball. He volunteered at his church. He was the kind of man who, if your car broke down on the side of the road, would stop and help you fix it without asking for a dime. The kind of man who made this country great, even though nobody writes news stories about people like him. In March of 2019, Daniel started feeling sick. At first, he thought it was just the flu. But the tiredness wouldn't go away. Then came the pain. His wife finally convinced him to see a doctor. The diagnosis came back like a death sentence. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor said Daniel had maybe 6 months, maybe less. There was treatment available, but the survival rates were grim. Less than 3% of people with stage 4 pancreatic cancer live more than 5 years. Daniel knew what that meant. He was 52 years old. And he was dying. Now, most people in Daniel's position would fall apart. They'd get angry. They'd ask why me. They'd spend their remaining time feeling sorry for themselves. But Daniel Morrison wasn't most people. He'd learned from watching Clint Eastwood movies that a man faces death the same way he faces life, with dignity, with courage, without complaint. So Daniel started putting his affairs in order. He made sure his life insurance was updated. He had long conversations with his children about life and responsibility and treating people right. He told his wife that he'd had a good life, a blessed life, and that she shouldn't spend years grieving him. He wanted her to be happy. But there was one thing Daniel wanted before the end. One small wish. He told his wife one evening as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset. He said, "You know, honey, I'd give anything to meet Clint Eastwood. Just shake his hand once. Tell him thank you for all those movies, for showing people what a real man looks like." His wife's heart broke when she heard this, because she knew there was no way. Clint Eastwood was nearly 90 years old at the time. He rarely did public appearances. He lived a private life in California, far from the spotlight. What were the chances that a construction foreman from Pennsylvania could meet one of the most famous men in the world? But Daniel's daughter, Rebecca, a 28-year-old schoolteacher, decided to try anyway. She'd grown up watching her father work himself to exhaustion to provide for their family. She'd seen him sacrifice his own dreams so that she and her brothers could go to college. She'd watched him face his terminal diagnosis with a strength that amazed everyone who knew him. If her father's dying wish was to meet Clint Eastwood, then by God, she was going to make it happen or die trying. Rebecca started with social media. She wrote a heartfelt post on Facebook explaining her father's situation and his wish to meet Clint Eastwood. She included photos of her father, pictures from throughout his life. Daniel in his high school football uniform. Daniel on his wedding day. Daniel holding his newborn children. Daniel at work sites, always with a smile, always with his crew. The post went viral. Within 3 days, it had been shared over 200,000 times. Local news stations picked up the story. Then national news. Suddenly, Daniel Morrison's final wish was making headlines across America. But here's the thing about viral stories. They come and go like summer storms. People share them. They feel good for a moment. Then they move on. Rebecca knew she needed to do more. So she started writing letters. Not emails. Actual, handwritten letters. She wrote to Clint Eastwood's production company, Malpaso Productions. She wrote to Warner Brothers. She wrote to every contact she could find. Most of the letters went unanswered. Some came back with polite form responses thanking her for her interest, but explaining that Mr. Eastwood maintains a private life and doesn't do personal appearances. Rebecca didn't give up. She kept writing. She kept calling. She kept pushing. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to pick up. The voice on the other end was quiet, gravelly, unmistakable. "Is this Rebecca Morrison?" the voice asked. Rebecca's hands started shaking. "Yes," she managed to say. "This is Clint Eastwood," the voice said. "I got your letters. Tell me about your father." For the next 20 minutes, Rebecca told Clint everything. She told him about her father's hard life and good heart, about the cancer that was stealing him away too soon, about the countless times Daniel had referenced Clint Eastwood's characters when teaching his children about honor and integrity, about how, even now, as the pain got worse and the treatments made him weak, Daniel never complained. He just faced each day like William Money, facing down Little Bill and Unforgiven. With quiet determination. When Rebecca finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Then Clint Eastwood said something that made Rebecca start crying. He said, "Your father sounds like a better man than any character I've ever played. I'd be honored to meet him." Rebecca could barely speak. "Really?" she asked. "You'd really come?" Clint's response was simple. "Tell me when and where." Now here's where the story gets truly remarkable. At the time of this phone call, Clint Eastwood was scheduled to begin an international press tour for his new film. We're talking about commitments in London, Paris, Rome, Tokyo, dozens of interviews with major media outlets, promotional appearances worth millions of dollars to the studio, the kind of obligations that you simply don't cancel in Hollywood. Contracts had been signed, travel had been arranged. But when Clint Eastwood's publicist informed him that meeting Daniel Morrison would require canceling at least the first week of the press tour, Clint didn't hesitate. "Cancel it," he said. The publicist tried to explain the consequences. The studio would be furious. There would be financial penalties. His professional relationships could be damaged. Clint Eastwood, this man who had survived and thrived in Hollywood for over 60 years, said something that silenced everyone in the room. He said, "I've made enough movies and enough money. That man is dying. Nothing is more important than that." Word spread quickly through Hollywood that Clint Eastwood had canceled major press obligations to visit a dying fan. The reactions were mixed. Some people praised him. Others thought he was being foolish, jeopardizing business relationships for sentiment. Some studio executives were privately furious. But Clint didn't care about any of that. On May 2nd, 2019, he boarded a private plane to Pennsylvania. Daniel Morrison had no idea this was happening. His family had decided to keep it secret, afraid that if they told him and something fell through, the disappointment would crush him. On the morning of May 3rd, Daniel was in his hospital room at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center. The cancer had progressed rapidly. He was weak, spending most of his time sleeping. His family was gathered around him. The doctors had said it could be any day now. Daniel's wife held his hand. His children sat beside the bed, trying to memorize every detail of their father's face. And then the door opened. A tall figure stepped into the room. Broad shoulders, that distinctive posture, that face that had stared down bad guys in dozens of movies. Clint Eastwood walked quietly to Daniel's bedside. Daniel's eyes opened slowly. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, that the medication was making him see things. But then Clint Eastwood spoke in that voice that everyone in the world would recognize. He said, "Daniel, I'm Clint Eastwood. I heard you wanted to meet me." What happened next, according to everyone in that room, was one of the most beautiful moments they'd ever witnessed. Daniel Morrison, this tough construction worker who had faced his terminal cancer without shedding a tear, started crying. Not sobs, just quiet tears running down his face. He tried to sit up, but he was too weak. Clint gently put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Stay comfortable. I'm not going anywhere." Clint Eastwood pulled up a chair and sat beside Daniel's bed. And for the next 4 hours, they talked. Not about movies, not about Hollywood. They talked about life, about family, about what it means to be a good man, about facing fear and death with dignity. Clint told Daniel stories from his own life, about growing up poor during the Depression, about all the times he failed before he succeeded, about the people who helped him along the way, about his own fears and doubts. This legendary Hollywood figure, this icon of masculinity and strength, opened up to a dying construction worker from Pennsylvania in a way that he rarely did with anyone. Daniel's family watched in amazement. They saw their husband and father, who had been so weak and tired, suddenly animated and engaged. The pain seemed to leave his face for those few hours. He was laughing at Clint's stories, sharing his own, talking about his work, his family, his life. It was as if Clint Eastwood's presence had given Daniel a temporary reprieve from death itself. At one point, Daniel said something that everyone in the room remembers. He looked at Clint and said, "You know, all these years I admired you because you played heroes on screen. But the real hero is someone who shows up for a nobody like me when he doesn't have to." Clint Eastwood shook his head. "You're not a nobody, Daniel. You raised good kids. You worked hard your whole life. You're facing the end with more courage than most people face an ordinary day. You're more of a man than any character I've played." Before Clint left, he did something else remarkable. He spent time with each member of Daniel's family individually. He talked to Daniel's wife about the importance of grief, but also about finding joy again. He talked to each of Daniel's children about honoring their father's memory by living with the same integrity he showed them. He signed photographs. He took pictures. But more than that, he listened. He gave them his full attention. This man who could have been anywhere in the world, who had canceled million-dollar obligations, sat in a hospital room and made a dying man and his family feel like they were the most important people on earth. When it was time to leave, Clint stood up and took Daniel's hand one more time. He leaned in close and said something that only Daniel heard. To this day, the family doesn't know what Clint whispered to their father, but they saw Daniel smile, a real, genuine smile, and they saw him nod. Whatever Clint Eastwood said, it gave Daniel Morrison peace. Clint Eastwood left the hospital that evening. He didn't talk to the press. He didn't publicize what he'd done. He simply got back on his plane and flew home. The story only came out later because Daniel's family felt the world needed to know what kind of man Clint Eastwood really is. Daniel Morrison passed away 8 days later, on May 11th, 2019. His family said those last days were different than they would have been. Daniel talked often about his visit with Clint, about what they discussed, about how Clint Eastwood, this legendary figure, had treated him not like a fan, but like an equal, like a friend. Daniel died peacefully, surrounded by family, with that smile still on his face. At Daniel's funeral, there were over 500 people, construction workers, church members, Little League players he'd coached, neighbors whose lives he'd touched. And there in the back, sitting quietly without fanfare, was Clint Eastwood. He'd flown across the country again. He sat through the entire service. He didn't make a speech. He didn't draw attention to himself. When it was over, he spoke briefly with Daniel's family, offered his condolences, and left as quietly as he'd arrived. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because in a world that seems to have lost its way, where celebrities lecture us about morality while living in mansions, where people are famous for being famous, where self-promotion and selfishness seem to rule everything, Clint Eastwood showed us something different. He showed us that character isn't about what you say. It's about what you do when nobody's watching. It's about the choices you make when those choices cost you something. Clint Eastwood lost money on that canceled press tour. He damaged some professional relationships. He could have sent a signed photograph or a video message. Most celebrities would have done exactly that and felt good about themselves. But Clint understood something that our modern world has forgotten. He understood that some things matter more than money or fame or convenience. That showing up matters. That treating ordinary people with dignity and respect matters. That when someone is facing their final days, your presence is the greatest gift you can give. Think about this for a moment. Clint Eastwood didn't have to do any of this. He's 94 years old now. He's earned his rest. He's earned the right to say no to anything he doesn't want to do. He could live out his days in comfort and luxury, and nobody would blame him. But that's not who he is. That's not how he was raised. His generation, your generation, understood something about duty and honor that we're in danger of losing. You know, there's a reason why Clint Eastwood's characters resonate so deeply with people. It's not because they're perfect. It's because they're real. They're flawed men who try to do the right thing even when it's hard, even when it costs them. They're men who understand that your word means something, that your actions define you, that how you treat people, especially people who can't do anything for you, reveals your true character. Clint Eastwood doesn't just play those characters. He lives them. Daniel Morrison's story spread far and wide after his death. Millions of people heard about what Clint Eastwood did. And you know what the most common reaction was? People weren't surprised. Because once you dig into Clint Eastwood's life, you find story after story like this. Stories that didn't make headlines. Stories about a superstar who treats the janitor on his film set with the same respect he treats the studio head. About a director who remembers every crew member's name. About a wealthy man who still tips generously and thanks people for their service. About someone who uses his fame not to demand special treatment, but to lift up others. There's a famous story from the set of Gran Torino. Clint was directing and starring. There was a young Hmong actor who was nervous, struggling with his lines. A big-shot method actor might have gotten impatient, might have made the kid feel small. But Clint took the young man aside, spent an hour working with him, building his confidence, making him feel capable. That young actor later said that Clint Eastwood changed his life, not because of fame or connections, but because he treated him like he mattered. Or consider this. In 2012, Clint Eastwood was at a golf tournament. He saw a young soldier in uniform sitting alone. The soldier had lost his leg in Afghanistan. He was struggling with depression, feeling forgotten by his country. Clint walked over, sat down beside him, and they talked for over an hour. The soldier later said that conversation saved his life, that Clint Eastwood helped him see that his sacrifice mattered, that his life still had purpose. Clint never mentioned this to anyone. The story only came out when the soldier wrote about it years later. These aren't isolated incidents. This is who Clint Eastwood is. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. He doesn't do these things for publicity. In fact, he actively avoids publicity for his good deeds. He believes, like his generation believed, that you don't do good things to be praised. You do them because they're right, because someone needs help, Because you have the ability to make a difference in someone's life, and that's reason enough. Compare that to today's world. We live in an age where people record themselves, giving a homeless person a sandwich so they can post it online and get likes. Where every act of charity becomes a photo opportunity. Where celebrities fall over themselves to signal their virtue while doing nothing of substance. Clint Eastwood represents something that we desperately need to remember. That true goodness doesn't require an audience. That real character shows itself in quiet moments, in private decisions, in how you treat people when there's nothing in it for you. Now, some people might say, well, it's easy for Clint Eastwood to be generous. He's rich and famous. But that misses the point entirely. Plenty of rich and famous people are selfish. Plenty of celebrities wouldn't dream of canceling professional obligations for a dying fan they'd never met. The point isn't that Clint has resources. The point is what he chooses to do with those resources. The point is his values. Values that were formed long before he had money or fame. Values that his parents instilled in him during the Great Depression. Values that your generation understands better than any generation since. You see, you folks watching this, you who lived through World War II or were raised by people who did, you understand sacrifice. You understand duty. You understand that life isn't about maximizing your own comfort and happiness. It's about contributing something meaningful. It's about looking out for others. It's about leaving the world a little better than you found it. These aren't old-fashioned ideas. These are timeless truths that every functioning society depends on. And when we lose sight of them, we lose something essential about what it means to be human. Clint Eastwood's visit to Daniel Morrison wasn't just a kind gesture. It was a statement about what matters, about how we should treat each other, about the kind of society we want to live in. It was a reminder that we're all connected, that we all deserve dignity and respect, that fame and fortune don't make you better than anyone else. They just give you a bigger platform to either help people or disappoint them. Daniel Morrison's daughter, Rebecca, said something beautiful after her father died. She said, "My dad always told us to be like Clint Eastwood, to be strong, to be honest, to do what's right even when nobody's watching." And then Clint Eastwood showed us that he was trying to be like people like my dad, like the ordinary people who work hard and love their families and face life's challenges with courage. It was like they saw the same thing in each other, the same basic goodness. Isn't that profound? This legendary Hollywood icon and this ordinary construction worker recognized each other as kindred spirits. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about where you're from or how much money you have. It's about the choices you make. It's about whether you lift people up or tear them down. It's about whether you show up when it costs you something. You know, we're living in difficult times. The world seems more divided, more angry, more selfish than ever before. Young people are being taught that life is about getting what's yours, about maximizing your personal happiness, about looking out for number one. Traditional values are mocked as outdated. The very idea of sacrifice or duty is seen as naive. But you know better. You've lived long enough to see where that kind of thinking leads. To loneliness, to broken families, to communities that don't care for each other, to a society where everyone's out for themselves and nobody trusts anyone. Clint Eastwood's story reminds us that there's another way, that the old values, your values, still work, still matter, still produce good people and strong communities and meaningful lives. It reminds us that one person, living with integrity and treating others with kindness, can make a real difference, not by preaching or lecturing, but by example, by showing up, by doing the right thing even when it's inconvenient. Think about the ripple effects of what Clint did. Daniel Morrison died happy, knowing that his hero cared enough to visit him. Daniel's family was comforted, their grief eased by the memory of those precious hours. But it goes beyond that. Every person who heard this story was touched by it. Thousands of people were reminded that goodness still exists, that there are still people worth looking up to, that fame and success don't have to corrupt you. Young people heard this story and maybe, just maybe, thought differently about what kind of person they want to be. That's the power of one good deed. It spreads. It inspires. It gives people hope. In a world drowning in bad news and cynicism, Stories like this are life rafts. They remind us of our better angels. They show us that the world isn't as dark as it sometimes seems. Now, I want you to think about your own life for a moment. You don't have to be Clint Eastwood to make a difference. You don't need fame or fortune. You just need to care. You just need to show up for people, to treat others with dignity, to do the right thing even when nobody's watching. Every one of you has opportunities every single day to be like Clint Eastwood, to visit a lonely neighbor, to encourage a struggling young person, to help someone who can't repay you, to choose kindness over convenience. The greatest tragedy of our time isn't economic or political. It's that we've forgotten how to be good to each other. We've forgotten that we're all in this together. We've forgotten that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give. Clint Eastwood hasn't forgotten. Your generation hasn't forgotten. And it's up to us to make sure the next generation doesn't forget either. Daniel Morrison's final wish wasn't for wealth or fame. It was for connection, for meaning, for the chance to thank someone who had inspired him. And Clint Eastwood honored that wish not because he had to, but because he understood something fundamental. He understood that Daniel Morrison mattered, that his life had value, that his dying wish deserved respect. In doing so, Clint showed us all what real greatness looks like. It's not about how many movies you make or how much money you earn. It's about how you treat people, especially the people who society says don't matter. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. First, never underestimate the impact of showing up. Your presence, your attention, your time, these are precious gifts. Don't waste them on things that don't matter. Give them to people who need them. Second, character is built in private moments. It's the decision you make when nobody's watching that defines who you really are. Third, we're all connected. That construction worker in Pennsylvania and that Hollywood legend shared something fundamental. A belief in decency, in honor, in doing right by people. Those bonds matter more than all the things that divide us. And finally, it's never too late to live with integrity. Clint Eastwood is in his 90s and still making choices that honor his values. You're never too old to do good. You're never too old to make a difference. You're never too old to show someone that they matter. The world needs more people like Clint Eastwood, more people like Daniel Morrison, more people like you, who remember what real character looks like, who understand that some things are more important than money or convenience or comfort, who are willing to show up, to sacrifice, to do the right thing even when it costs you something. Daniel Morrison's story ended in a hospital room in Pennsylvania, but its impact continues. Every time someone hears about what Clint Eastwood did, something changes in them. They're reminded that goodness is real, that heroes exist, that one person can make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, they're inspired to show up for someone in their own life, to visit that sick friend, to help that struggling neighbor, to treat people with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. That's Clint Eastwood's real legacy. Not the movies, though they're magnificent. Not the awards, though he's earned plenty. His real legacy is showing us, again and again, what it means to be a good man, to live with honor, to treat people right, to show up when it matters. That's why his characters resonate so deeply, because they're not just characters. They're reflections of who he really is. So the next time you watch a Clint Eastwood movie, remember Daniel Morrison. Remember a construction worker from Pennsylvania who loved those films because they represented the values he tried to live by. And remember that the man who made those films lived those values too. That he canceled million-dollar obligations to sit beside a dying fan's bed. That he showed up. That he cared. That he understood what really matters in this life. We're losing that generation. The generation that understood duty and sacrifice and honor. But their values don't have to die with them. We can carry them forward. We can teach them to our children and grandchildren. We can live them in our own lives. And when we do, when we choose kindness over convenience, when we show up for people who need us, when we treat everyone with dignity regardless of their station in life, we honor not just Clint Eastwood and Daniel Morrison, but everyone who came before us and believed in those timeless truths. The world tells us that nice guys finish last, that looking out for yourself is the only way to survive, that traditional values are outdated. But Clint Eastwood's life proves otherwise. He's been at the top of his profession for over 60 years. He's respected and admired by millions. And he did it without compromising his values, without stepping on people, without becoming the cynical, selfish kind of celebrity that Hollywood usually produces. He did it by being decent, by working hard, by treating people right. And in the end, that's what people remember. Not the box office numbers, not the awards, but the man himself, the choices he made, the lives he touched. Daniel Morrison's dying wish was granted because Clint Eastwood understood something that our world desperately needs to relearn: that we're all human, that we all deserve dignity, that showing up for someone, really showing up, is the most important thing you can do. It's a lesson worth remembering, worth living, worth passing on. So go ahead, share this story, tell your friends and family, remind people that there are still good men in this world, that character still matters, that the old values still work. And most importantly, look for opportunities in your own life to be like Clint Eastwood, to show up, to care, to do the right thing even when nobody's watching, because that's how we change the world, not through grand gestures or viral moments, but through quiet acts of kindness and decency. One person at a time, one choice at a time. That's the lesson of Clint Eastwood and Daniel Morrison, and it's a lesson that will never go out of style.